It is braided horsehair. My father always wanted a braided horsehair belt, but he thought they were too expensive, so he never bought them. And as a result, he tried to make his own. He combed out a horse's mane and tail to get the horsehair and tried to braid it, but it didn't work out. And anyway, he always wanted one. And he told me, "Do you know where they're made?" And I said, "No." He said, "Mexican prisons." So that's where horsehair belts come from. But I bought this from a friend of my father's by the name of Rick Brown, who ran the polo shop on the plaza. And one of my dad's great pleasures in life was to go to Rick after having gone to a garage sale or an estate sale or a farm auction and bring men's clothing to Rick and show them to Rick and then ask Rick how much he paid for it. So he would come to Rick and he would say, "How much did I pay for these pants, Rick?" And he would say, "I don't know, George." And I said, "You think I paid $50? "I don't know, George." And get down lower and lower and lower. He said, 25 cents for the bag. Great victory by that. And another thing, he would also go to Rick and he would bring clothes that he had bought at a garage sale and then try to get Rick's approval for them. And he would show these things to him and he'd say, "Look, Rick, what do you think of this?" And he'd say, "No, George, no." And my dad would say, "Well, but what about in California?" And he'd say, "No, George, not even in California." So I bought this from Rick, but in honor of my father, I got it on sale. And then it's because it didn't fit me and got it adjusted at Overland Park Shoe Repair. Go there sometime. Henry, he's great. Anyway, this is my new belt. This is my old belt, and this is a belt that my father gave me. He gave it to me on a random occasion, and I wore it every day for as long as he was alive, and I took it off for the first time actually on Saturday. But my dad, when he was in a neurological fog sometimes, if he came to visit him, he wouldn't know who I was. Jeff became, we kind of had collective sons all named Jeff. And he wouldn't know who I was, or sometimes he just didn't know what was going on. But when he saw that belt, he would go, "That's a nice belt." And I would then say, "Well, Dad, you gave me that belt." He said, "Yes, I brought that in New Mexico." So that he could return to reality. So anyway, that's about the accessories. But people have asked me, "How am I doing?" And I just say I'm rather dull at this point. I feel dull. But I don't feel a loss of my father because there's a story that is the only way I know how to describe it. I heard this story of a sheep herder in the Rocky Mountains, and he wore a union suit all year long, and he wouldn't take it off. And the union suit, you can perform, it's like a long underwear, you can perform most bodily functions in a union suit, so the man never took it off. And he lived, didn't have any social collars, so he kept the thing on all the time. And then eventually he discovered that his hair had grown into the fibers of the union suit and that he had to be sheared to get it off. And that's the way I feel about my dad, that I don't know how to ever extricate myself from my dad because he's so involved in my life. And if my life was a crime scene, his fingerprints are all on it. But as much as that's the case, my dad also had many lives before I ever met him. And on one occasion, I had the discovery of this. I was at a gathering where I was not invited. I was a guest of a guest of a guest. But I wanted to meet the hosts because they had this really interesting art collection, and I didn't know them, and I wasn't invited. And I found more out about them. I figured out, well, they have to know my dad. So anyway, I went up to the man, and I said, "Oh, I'm George Jackson." He was like, "Oh, George." And so he knew my dad, and they knew my mom, and everything was good. And so I got to see their art and talk to them. And then eventually, a woman came up behind me, and she had overheard this conversation, and she said, "Are you George Jackson's son?" Yes, I am. "Well, your father was engaged to blah, 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 and she had a room at the Pi-Fi house at KU, and he was supposed to marry her, and then I was supposed to get her room, but your father broke off the engagement, and as a result of that, she stayed in the Pi-Fi house, and because of that, I had to stay at home for 1 more year." And then I guess sorry, I didn't know what else to do. There was this whole life before. I would get glimpses of it. One time my dad was watching TV or something, and there was some Caribbean island that was on TV, and he started talking about how he had been there in 1950 something, and how the music was playing, and how he was calypsoing until dawn on the beach. And I said, Dad, with whom were you calypsoing? And he paused most. With a native woman. There's another part of family lore where my dad, my mother, shortly after marrying him, discovered a box of souvenirs from his fraternity days at Washington University. And as a result of this discovery, she discovered that my dad had a large following among the women's colleges in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And certain results from that were that, one, I would never be allowed to join a fraternity, and two, never attend Washington Lee. So that's the first part of my dad that I never knew, and my dad made it change when he met my mother. And a lot of things shifted. She was an unlikely choice for him. She was a single mom taking care of a young son and taking care of an invalid mother herself. She was also totally uninterested in him, and none of that seemed to bother him. And he was willing to marry her, even though she claimed to not love him, claiming that she would eventually. And after this, my father had been a sort of active social drinker and a sort of a nominal church attender, became a teetotaler and a Bible-believing Christian. And my dad became a man of faith. It was something that was maybe quiet, but it was a part of his life. He wasn't loud about it, but it was part of him. And so that was sort of the next phase. And then eventually, my dad had a variety of successes in his life in business, his personal life, and everything else. And then at some point, he discovered the equestrian and the agriculture. And after that happened, my dad changed. That became the emphasis in his life. And all kinds of decisions started being made as a result of that. And my dad was someone who had a lot of plans. He had a lot of visions. But one thing my dad did not plan for, he never planned for a lack of success. My dad never planned for a lack of vitality. He never planned for a lack of mental or physical acuity. And as his life changed, he had to make changes. My dad wanted certain things to happen that didn't happen. And I had said to him at one point, Dad, if you keep your hand open, God can put things in or can take them out. But if you make a fist, you'll have to have your fingers broken. And in some ways that did happen to my father. But the impressive part was at the end of his life, something kind of beautiful happened. My dad had many colleagues and friends who were a certain kind of alpha male, who when they encountered difficulty or dishonor or failure, they killed themselves. They lived like samurai, and when they encountered difficulty, that was the end. And with my dad, that was never the case. He never quit, he never gave up, and he never said, why me? And he never complained. And it became impressive that though my dad had plans for his life, God had another plan for my dad's life. And at the last 5 years, my dad, who was someone who could anger me more than anyone on the planet, God was able to show me that my dad had had neurological difficulties and struggles that were there before we even knew them. And that I was able to see that my dad had done the best that he could. And God gave grace in that situation. And the thing that was interesting is at the end of my dad's life, he was actually able to father me in ways that he might not have done before. I was encountering some real struggles, and my dad, we never knew what he knew or what he didn't know. And at one point he asked me, well, how are you doing? I said, well, Dad, I'm having a really hard time. And he said, I understand, but you must remember, you must win. And this was a person who some days could stand up, some days couldn't, who was some days in a diaper, and some days wasn't, who some days thought he was at his farm, and some days thought he was at the Commerce Bank building in 1983. And even in all of this, he never quit, and he never stopped, and he modeled a kind of resilience that was beautiful. And when Mark came to visit my dad, even at the end of his life, was not willing to give up. And so when Mark showed up, he had this sort of quizzical kind of thing like, wait a second, the minister's coming. So he seemed to take that as a sign that something was changing. And Mark prayed for him, though, and Mark said to him, you know, George, your body, the one you have, isn't working anymore. And God has a better one for you. And that, I think, gave my dad some peace and an opportunity that he, after 30 years of fighting his own body, he could let go. And the interesting thing is that this is all extemporaneous, but I have 2 quotes that I do have to read. The last time my dad was able to interact with me before he died, he couldn't speak anymore, but he could kind of cock his eye, so you kind of see some kind of response or whatever. And we had to sell part of the farm, and we never told my dad because what good would that do? And the thing, when we sold that property, he had these black walnut trees that had been burned down once and cut another time, but he had kept coming back and watering them again and again and again. And we sold that land, and that was the thing that sort of broke my heart. Like, oh, my dad's walnut trees. Walnut trees are gone. And interestingly enough, when I was seeing my dad at the very end of his life, I would go out in the fields and I would work on stuff and do different things. And he had an area that he had designated as his nursery. And his nursery were trees that he was wanting to move, and he had never moved them. And so as a result, they'd gotten too big to move. So they were overgrown, and some of them had to be cut down or trimmed back and whatever else. But I was going over because he had actually a cherry tree, and I went to look for it, and when I turned the corner, I saw something that just blew my mind, which was walnut trees. My dad had a whole patch of walnut trees. They're producing. And I was able to go to my dad as he was close to death, and I said, Dad, look, you have walnuts. And there's a line from Hamlet that I have memorized. There's a divinity that shapes our ends. Rough hew them how we will. But this is where I get to the earlier part of the speech. It's let us know our indiscretion sometimes serves us well. When our deep plots do pall, and that should learn us, there's a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will. And that really, my dad had a plan, but God had a plan, and in the end, it was better. And there's another line from Corinthians which says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And even though my dad, as he declined, he had everything he needed. He wasn't in pain. He was surrounded by his family. He got to die in bed at the place he wanted to be. And in the end, to me, he was a success. So, thank you. I guess Rugged Cross is now next.